I'm delighted to be here. I mean, I'm not just going to talk about the flaws of statins. I've been asked to talk about my personal experiences and the challenges that I faced in trying to relay the limitations of the statin data to the public. So just very briefly about myself, there are no conflicts of interest. I have a PhD in rheumatology, so I'm not a medical doctor. I'm not here to tell you that statins are bad or good. I'm all about informed consent, so I encourage people to just get as much information as they can about these medications and keep an eye out for limitations of the data so they can make informed choices for themselves. I've also worked as a political advisor and speechwriter for the Science Minister in South Australia. And for over a decade, I worked as a TV producer and presenter for the Australian Broadcasting Corporation, which is quite different to the ABC here in the States. The one in Australia is fully publicly funded, so it's meant to be independent journalism and free of conflicts from or pressure from industry or government. Currently, I'm working as a researcher for the Nordic Cochrane Centre. I work as an investigative journalist, as a freelancer, and I also do a bit of PR for a health clinic in Melbourne. So as a science reporter and a medical reporter, I would often do a deep dive into the science and I would come out with very disappointing conclusions. And over my career, I started to become a little dismayed with the quality of the science. And that certainly, I reached the same conclusion as John Ioannidis. He's a respected professor at Stanford University, and back in 2005 he published this paper titled "Why Most Published Research Findings Are False." And like you heard this morning, about 90% of published research that doctors rely on is flawed, according to John Ioannidis. And he says it's because clinical trials have selection bias and poor design that we've heard about today, confounders and conflicts of interest. And this is generally accepted widely by not just the medical community, but also the scientific community. We also know that there's a whole lot of wasted resources going into research. So in 2010, Ian Chalmers and Paul Glasziou published a paper that showed 85% of research investment, which equates to about $200 billion, is wasted on badly designed or redundant studies. So we have a whole lot more clinical trials and a whole lot more information, but it doesn't mean it's good information. So it's not surprising that the public doesn't know what to believe, because one day you'll hear something is good for you and the next day you'll hear it's bad for you. And it's because single studies often contradict each other and they are very rarely replicated. And this is an analysis by researchers that show that just about everything we eat both causes cancer and prevents cancer, depending on which clinical trial you want to refer to. So each dot is a clinical trial. So an explanation for the confusion. So it's not surprising that people's trust in the pharmaceutical industry has declined. A PR firm last year actually surveyed Americans and found that trust in drug companies plummeted from 51% down to 38%, and that was the largest drop in 5 years. And this was largely attributed to the opioid crisis, rising cost of medicines, and this idea that drug companies put profits ahead of patients. More concerning is that we're seeing a dwindling trust in the medical experts. And this paper was published in the BMJ just recently, showing that measles outbreaks and the low uptake of the measles vaccine has been attributed to people's incredulity and hostility towards doctors and governments. So these are generally trusted professions and organisations that people are turning away from. And there's an increasing anger and suspicion towards elites and experts. And I'll go into a little bit more about that quite soon. So as I mentioned, I'm going to talk a little bit about statins, and some of the limitations of the data so that you can look at it with a more critical eye. So most of you know they are the most widely prescribed cholesterol lowering medications in the world, and an extremely lucrative drug class, with Lipitor being the most profitable drug in the history of medicine. There's been an exponential rise in the use of statins. We know that the early clinical trials showed that there was pretty good benefit for people at high risk of cardiovascular disease. So that's people who've already had a heart attack or a stroke, and so they're in the secondary prevention category to prevent a second heart attack. But then we started hearing from the experts, and they were suggesting, well, perhaps everybody over the age of 50 should be on these medications, even if you didn't have high cholesterol. So they were talking about medicating a rather healthy population of people, and this is the primary prevention group of people that we're going to talk about and where the most debate lies. But then we started hearing from paediatricians saying, well, perhaps we need to screen children for high cholesterol so we can screen for potential statin recipients. And Pfizer even jumped on board and started marketing a grape-flavoured statin in order to be more palatable for kids. There's a high-profile cardiologist in the UK who published a paper in the American Journal of Cardiology, and it received worldwide headlines, suggesting that statins are so safe and so effective that we should hand them out as condiments in burger outlets to counter the negative effects of a fast food meal. And this, I think, has been incredibly damaging because it gives people the impression that somehow they are protected by taking a statin while still eating crappy meals. And so people are less inclined, because they become complacent, to implement lifestyle interventions because they're taking a statin and they won't have a heart attack, which of course is not true. We've even had debates about putting statins in the water supply. How ridiculous has this become? And this is really the reason why there has been a huge divide between the medical community. So we're having an acrimonious debate at the moment about statins. And it's been dubbed the Statine Wars, and I've written about this and published it last year in the British Journal of Sports Medicine. So we have two sides. The proponents are saying statins are so safe and so effective, they've prevented untold heart attacks and strokes, everybody should be on them. Then we have the other side who say, well, no, they might protect a couple of people, but for the vast majority of people, they don't really do much. They don't save lives because people still end up dying, but they might prolong your life. One study showed maybe 3 to 4 days. So that's the two sides of the argument. I think a lot of the problems started in the mid-80s when former US President Ronald Reagan decided to significantly slash funding to the National Institutes of Health. And this allowed private industry to move in and start funding their own clinical trials. And this is where people became concerned because this is the sort of fox guarding the hen house, so to speak. The drug companies designing their own clinical trials without oversight started making people feel nervous. We started to discover through legal suits that pharmaceutical companies were hiring marketing firms or getting marketing people to do the first drafts of their manuscripts that they would submit for peer review in order to give a positive spin on the trial data. And this, whilst it might not sound ethical, it's a perfectly legal thing to be doing. If drug companies are sorry, that's not very good lighting there, but if drug companies are sponsoring their own clinical trials, they can also design them in a way that minimises the harms. And they can do this, that top box says, by implementing a run-in period. So these run-in periods involve putting everybody on the medication for a period of 6 weeks. And then at the end of the 6 weeks, people will drop out for various reasons, just non-compliance, not feeling good, having side effects. Then, with that freshly culled population of people, they do the randomisation, half to statins, half to placebo. And this is what happened in the HPS trial. They saw a 36% drop in participants. That is a lot of people. It turned out to be 11,000 people dropped out just in the run-in period before they started randomising. So you can imagine when you get to the end of the clinical trial, you see that the side effects are often pretty similar in the statin group as they are in the placebo group. Well, that's because most of your recipients dropped out. And we think that that's probably why the rate of harms in the statin trials, which we're constantly told are quite rare, are wildly different to what doctors see in real-world observations. So most cardiologists that you'll speak to say, 1 in 5 patients experience muscle pains, memory fog, they develop cataracts or increased blood glucose levels as a result of taking statins. So that's where the divide has occurred. Changing thresholds has been a significant factor in overdiagnosis and overtreatment. So, for example, in the early 2000s, the National Cholesterol Education Program simply lowered changed the definition of high cholesterol by lowering the threshold. So that meant millions more people overnight become eligible for medications through no extra science, just simply this idea that lowering your cholesterol to rock bottom is the best way to go. And of course, there were issues because it was revealed that 8 out of 9 panel members, I think it was the 2000 panel, had direct financial ties to statin manufacturers. And this is a pretty neat paper that was published by IRIS researchers just this year, which demonstrates that lowering thresholds significantly increases the proportion of people that are on statins in primary prevention. So they looked at the thresholds in 1987 and found that 8% of people would be eligible for statins, and this skyrocketed to 61% in 2016, just by changing the thresholds. So this is really, again, driving overdiagnosis and unnecessary treatment of cardiovascular disease. This is also a neat paper by James Wright is one of the authors. This is a cohort in British Columbia, and they determined that 85% of people who are on statins are in the primary prevention group. So if we think about that, you just take that at face value, 85% of people on statins are in primary prevention, and say 100 million people are on statins. That means 85 million healthy people at low risk of cardiovascular disease receive almost no benefit from these medications. One of the big issues with the statin data, which is really quite unique, is that a lot of the data has been hidden from sight. So the raw data really exists with a single group of researchers at Oxford University called the Cholesterol Treatment Trialists Collaboration, or CTT. So as a journalist working for the ABC, I approached them in 2013 and I asked them about access to this data that nobody had seen before. And they confirmed to me that the trial data would not be released to third parties because they had signed a legally binding agreement which prevented them from sharing the data in order to gain exclusive access for themselves. So we have a situation where a legally binding agreement prevents researchers from sharing their results. So the CTT, which is headed by Professor Rory Collins, they defend it by saying, that they actually release periodically periodic analyses which advocate the wider use of statins in low-risk individuals. And this has been incredibly influential on the prescribing guidelines. So they're a pretty powerful group and are perceived to be quite elite. And they say, no problem at all. It doesn't matter that people haven't seen the data. We've seen it, and we are not funded by industry. However, in a stoush between Rory Collins and the BMJ, I think it was in maybe 2015, the BMJ obtained documents which revealed that the CTSU, which is the umbrella organisation that CTT underlies, has actually received over £260 million from manufacturers of cholesterol-lowering medications. So they still insist that they're an independent group. Now, they've been able to influence prescribing guidelines. they've also been able to sway the Cochrane collaboration, which we normally hold up to a high standard because they are relatively, I add relatively in there, Peter, relatively free of industry influence. So what happened with Cochrane was quite interesting because prior to 2013, Cochrane reviews expressed caution when prescribing statins in primary prevention. But then in 2013, they completely backflipped and they said, well, we propose extending statins to people at low risk. And they admitted that this backflip was based solely on the work of the CTT collaboration, the same group that holds exclusive access to the data that nobody can verify, nobody can authenticate because they don't have access to it. Cochrane concluded that taking statins did not increase the risk of serious adverse effects. Well, do they really know that? I mean, they didn't even do an assessment of it. I mean, what they saw was peer-reviewed literature, but they knew that there was a whole lot more data on serious adverse events that they had no access to. And they were called out for it in an editorial in the BMJ. This author said that Cochrane acknowledged that the adverse events were poorly characterised in the trials, but disappointingly, Cochrane showed no appetite to seek the data. So if Cochrane is not going to try and gain access to the data, what hope do we have? So it really begs the question, when we come to debating the benefits and the harms of a medication, are we really debating the best evidence? And should we perhaps blindly trust the CTT? Because they are sort of held up as the revered experts. So what do the experts say publicly about statins? If any of you follow the news, this was actually just a recent announcement. The experts say that statins are effective for elderly people, and they published this paper in The Lancet in February. And because they're respected researchers, it garnered international attention, and there were headlines all over the world saying that statins are safe to prescribe to people at the age over 75 years of age. This one says that statins can benefit all ages, including those over 75, and that giving statins to older people could save 8,000 lives a year. But when somebody went back and looked at what their data actually showed, in Table 5, when we're looking at vascular deaths, you'll see that people between 70 and 75 and 75 years and over had absolutely no statistically significant decrease in vascular death. So how could it save 8,000 lives if we're giving this to elderly people? When they were confronted about their misleading claims, journalists from the BMJ asked them, is this really a legitimate thing to be saying in public? They didn't recant their comments. In fact, they doubled down and said, this is our position. So, you know, it's not surprising that people feel reluctant to believe the experts. What else do they say? Okay, the experts say statins cause minimal side effects. So Rory Collins, who heads the CTSU, he said that statins are very well tolerated and that side effects are only, or muscle weakness only occurs 1 in 10,000 people. So that's pretty rare, 1 in 10,000 people. And that's what he's said publicly and has maintained this for years in the media. But then an investigation by the Times UK revealed that Professor Collins actually co-invented a diagnostic test for statin intolerance. And the marketing says muscle pains from statins are up to 29%. That's a far cry from 1 in 10,000 people. So privately, this is what the marketing on his test says. Publicly, he's saying that the statin side effects are rare. And when these investigative journalists confronted him about it, he dissociated himself and said, oh, you know, that's up to the manufacturer about what marketing claims they put on my test. He is maintaining that they're still rare. So, you know, we have a summary of drug trials being mostly industry funded, ghost-written journals to spin the data. They are designed to minimize the harms, secret data that cannot be verified by independent researchers, and of course experts, some would say misleading the public in the media. It's not that surprising that people feel quite skeptical about statins. So there have been several calls for transparency of the data, and there have been several initiatives that have been really good. So I think the first was in 2004, they introduced new regulations concerning the conduct of clinical trials, and it was aimed to lend more credibility to clinical trials, because we knew that, you know, drug companies might be being less than honest when conducting the trials. And so it led to a register in a recognised database like clinicaltrials.gov. So interestingly, a cardiologist decided to look at all the statin intervention trials that were done since the new regulations were introduced. So ignore all of the ones where there was a period of very little regulation and very little oversight of the drug companies, and let's just concentrate on the statins that the statin intervention trials that have happened post-2004. And he found that not a single trial found a mortality benefit since they introduced these new oversight regulations. That 2/3 did not even find a cardiovascular benefit. And he concluded, this is a cardiologist, concluded that cholesterol reduction via statins is not a powerful intervention for the prevention of cardiovascular disease. So this is where the skepticism really starts creeping in, even for secondary prevention, because the secondary prevention trials were all done pre-change in regulations. The 4S trial, the HPS trial, they were the ones that showed the most significant benefit, and we know that they were industry funded and with very little oversight. So you can see why there's a little bit of skepticism there. Another initiative to improve transparency of the data has been hugely significant. This is work that was led by Professor Peter Goetscher and his team at the Nordic Cochrane Centre, and they did something that few people thought would be possible. They managed to get the European Drug Agency to open access to the public for documents including unpublished trial results and protocols. And as a result of this, we now have access to what we call clinical study reports. So these are reports that are specifically written for the drug regulators, and they contain substantially more information about healthcare intervention than you would ever see in a peer-reviewed journal. So one trial might contain a stack of 8,000 papers compared to maybe 5 pages, 10 pages that you might see in a peer-reviewed journal. And so this has provided an opportunity for researchers to start analysing the clinical study reports. And there are several examples where assessing the clinical study reports has given dramatically different results from the sort of pre-existing view. And Tamiflu is one example of that. Just very briefly, there was a group of antiviral drugs that governments around the world had stockpiled, spent millions of dollars stockpiling this drug in the event of a flu pandemic in order to prevent complications from hospital admissions and reduce the duration of the flu. And then when Cochrane researchers gained access to the clinical study reports, they found a whole treasure trove of unpublished data that had never been seen before. So when they assessed this, they came out with the complete opposite view, that these drugs weren't as safe as they previously believed, and they didn't reduce hospital complications, and this was quite embarrassing to all the governments around the world that spent millions of dollars stockpiling a drug that sat in a warehouse that they say is probably no more better than the ordinary Advil or paracetamol that you get from the pharmacy. And just one last transparency initiative has been something that's recently happened. Doshi versus Health Canada So this is where Associate Professor Peter Doshi, an American researcher, he requested several trial documents from the Canadian drug regulator, Health Canada, and he was denied access initially to the documents because they asked him to sign a confidentiality agreement, which would prevent him from ever publishing his findings from what he was going to witness in these regulatory papers. So he refused to sign, of course, and he decided to file a lawsuit in the federal court seeking a judicial review. And just last year, the federal court judge ordered Health Canada to give Dr. Doshi access to these trial documents, a decision that many believe has paved the way for greater transparency. So I think this is the push where we need to go to gain access to the data. So there's no point having debates about the harms and benefits of these medications if we don't even have access to the data to debate it properly. And this is some of the work that has come out of the Nordic Cochrane Centre. It was work that Tom Jefferson and Peter Goetsch began, and I've jumped on board this project. We need an independent review of statins, and to do that, we think we kind of need to go back to square one and see where the trial data sits. So we're going to the drug regulators in Europe. We're asking them, on what basis did you make these licensing decisions for statins, and do you hold the clinical trial data? And if they do hold the clinical trial data, then we would like access to the clinical study reports so we can answer questions that we haven't been able to answer before, like, are there muscle pains giving people statins in primary prevention? And that way we can sort of bypass this roadblock that the CTT has put up in the past. So I'm going to finish the talk referring to some of the work that I did as a journalist in trying to relay a lot of these issues to the public. And when I worked for the broadcaster in 2013, I produced and presented a two-part series called Heart of the Matter. I'll just get a show of hands. Who's heard of these series? Yeah? Okay. Well, Mike Eads was in them. Gary? So this two-part series, the first one was really challenging this idea that saturated fat causes heart disease and looking at alternative reasons for what could be worsening cardiovascular disease. And the second one was looking at statin drugs. And we looked at the limitations of the trials, much of the stuff that I've talked about today, and we talked about how they are grossly overprescribed for healthy people in primary prevention. Now, when these programs went to air, we received a huge response from the public. Apart from the fact that we topped in the ratings, so for a public broadcaster to beat all the commercial TV stations was pretty profound. And we were being congratulated by ABC management, the managing director, director of television, head of factual. All of them wrote to us saying, intelligent, provocative journalism, this is exactly what we need as a public broadcaster. And we were sort of on a high for a while and enjoying the spoils of being patted on the back by the executives at the TV network. We also received a profound response from the public. They were like, it's about time somebody actually addressed this issue, because prior to 2013, we thought these drugs were blockbuster. And patients had been going to their doctors saying, well, I got muscle pain, I don't feel good, I got a bit of mental fatigue, and the doctors were like, it's all in your mind. And there were some patients that were reporting that they'd been fired from their doctors for even suggesting that they would stop their statins. So this really provided another sort of level of debate that was much needed in Australia. But that congratulatory feeling didn't last very long because, of course, as a public broadcaster, we also have to respond to people's complaints. And so, of course, the first complaint came from the Australian Heart Foundation, because they've been saying for decades, you must reduce your saturated fat intake. And the fact that we debunked that issue was quite embarrassing for them. In fact, they almost admitted it on camera that they had very little evidence for it. And I think that that's why they reacted so badly, because they kind of felt like the person that they put forward that I interviewed had essentially undermined 30 years of their dietary advice. Of course, the 3 largest statin manufacturers complained. That was no surprise. And Medicines Australia, called for the programs. They're saying that they're dangerous and that I need to be sacked. And they are an industry front group that represents pharmaceutical companies in Australia. Now, we were pretty cool about this, to be honest, because we had researched this to within an inch of its life. And we'd been working on it for several years. We'd interviewed hundreds of doctors, and we had a website that was dedicated to this series, where we had extended interviews and peer-reviewed journals and all the stuff that you would want to support a thesis that statins were overprescribed. But then something very unexpected happened that we weren't prepared for. Someone within the ranks of the ABC, so not someone within our team, but within ABC Radio, came out saying people will die if they watch this program. Well, you can imagine how the media fed on that. So it was this internal feud going on at the ABC. I mean, they loved it, to be honest. So the national headlines began. So they were saying, cholesterol programs will kill people, people will die, contribute to deaths. ABC has blood on its hands. I mean, it was pretty bad. We were getting smashed in the media, and this was a really difficult time to sort of sit through and watch this sort of all unfold. The ABC's reaction to it was to launch an investigation, which we thought was pretty fair. It turned out that investigation was 6 months. So we spent several weeks, even though the research period was over a period of 3 years, we spent maybe 2 or 3 months making these documentaries. We spent 6 months defending them. So we often spend longer defending programs than we do actually making them. And they came out to say after 6 months that there were no factual errors, and we were pretty pleased with that result, because we're factual programming and facts matter to us. Now, they did say that in one part of the program that we unduly favoured one side of the argument. So in the end, they thought that we favoured the side of Harvard professor John Abramson and Rita Redberg, editor-in-chief of the Annals of Internal Medicine, because they were all saying these drugs are really not that effective for people in primary prevention. So we gave more airtime to them than we did to the proponents. And we thought, that's a bit dicey, but they weren't scientists on that panel, and they didn't understand false balance in science reporting. And I was called up by the director of television, and he said, we've got some pretty hefty budget reviews coming up with the government. We really need to make this go away. So can you just sort of settle down, put your head down, and get on with your work? I did it reluctantly. But the important findings were that these programs were important for public debate, and that they had not unduly harmed people, and that they were to stay up because they were a valuable resource for people. So that was the ABC's own review recommendations. Then something, again, unexpected happened. The ABC, without warning, without compunction, banned the programs. They shut down the website and they replaced it with an apology. And we were shocked because we weren't even told that our own network was going to do this. So I turned up to, I actually just flew in, and I was at the carousel, and I opened my phone, and it just started to blow up, and people were saying, really sorry about what's happened. And I'm like, somebody died. No, they just banned my programs. And so, we went through a period of time of just not understanding why the ABC would do this, and we just felt that it was really weak of them to cower to this industry pressure. So, of course, this has really started up the media storm again. So I was being just dragged through the media, and science journalists can be a little competitive. So, you know, they didn't hold back when they were trying to discredit another colleague who does the same kind of work. And it became impossible to defend myself because I had a gag order on me. And that lasted 5 years. So I couldn't defend myself. And that was particularly painful because, I mean, I stopped reading eventually, but there were so many lies written about me, and all they were doing were just really attacking the characters of the people in the program without attacking the science. And I really wanted to say something, but I couldn't because I was receiving threatening emails like this one, for example. Marianne must not comment publicly nor privately share the details of this decision with anyone. We would consider this a breach in her employment conditions. I would strongly recommend that Marianne, she accepts this quietly and that protesting will not be helpful. Well, I kind of liked my job and I wanted to keep it. So I decided to demonstrate my loyalty to my employer, and I decided to shut up, basically, and take it. And there's very few things that I regret about my time at the ABC. I don't regret a single thing I ever put to air. But this is one decision I do regret because I was wounded with an unfair characterization of my ability as a scientist, as a reporter, just as a human being. And I just wasn't able to contest those mischaracterizations. So I think if I had my time again, I probably would have risked losing my job over it. So yeah, that's kind of an important lesson. But more damaging was the fact that it really just gave my enemies so much more ammunition to attack me with. And this is essentially what happened. Began the scare campaign. So in Australia, one of the members of the CTT Oversight Committee, who is based in Australia, she accused the program of killing up to 2,900 people, potentially fatal heart attacks and stroke. I mean, we were being accused of mass murder here. Thousands and thousands of people going off their medications. Collins from the CTT said people questioning statin side effects were far worse and had probably killed more people than the MMR vaccine. That's a bit over the top, don't you think? We had Steve Nissen from Cleveland Clinic saying, you know, we need to push back on people challenging statins because they're part of an internet cult. I mean, they don't even want people to challenge the research anymore. This is kind of crazy. They're calling us statin denialists, of course. And just recently, this is in reference to some of my colleagues in one of the UK papers, there's a special place in hell for people who question statins, saying that it's part of deadly propaganda. So this has been going on for quite a few years and really started to create a divide in the community. I put my head down and I thought, well, I've got nothing to lose. I'm going to continue making factual documentaries. I don't care who I piss off. And so I did. I got the telecommunications industry angry. I got the pharmaceutical industry angry. I got the food industry angry. I even got the sugar industry angry. We got a big sugar production in in Queensland, north of Australia. And so all of these organisations came out trying to attack me, and you know, I had kind of developed a reputation as the reporter who was anti-sugar. So, you know, I was getting constantly talked to by ABC executives saying, you know, the perception is that you just keep doing stories about how bad sugar is for you. And I'm like, that's what the science is telling me. So, you know, I was asked to sort of calm that down, but I was quite critical of, you know, Honey Cheerio breakfast cereals that got the tick of approval from the Heart Foundation because they're 60% sugar. So something I wasn't aware of that only actually became obvious to me years later was that there's this industry front group called the Australian Breakfast Cereals Manufacturing Forum. And it's an industry front group that represents the 3 largest cereal manufacturers in Australia. So Kellogg's, Nestle and Sanitarium. And they hold meetings and strategy meetings, and the confidential documents were leaked to me, which revealed their strategy for attacking dissenting views. And they listed a bunch of people who were on their hit list. I was on that hit list. So I was essentially targeted for what they call active defence. I hadn't heard of that term before, but active defence was really one of their strategies to diminish the reputation of people who talked about, undermined their messages, like I did in perhaps low-carb programs and statins when I was talking about it might be sugar and not the fat. So the way they do this is to hire media influencers and health practitioners like dietitians to go out there and write articles and publish things on social media in order to neutralise the negative media coverage of breakfast cereals. So I wrote about this and published it with Michael West, Biz, and I basically called them serial offenders, how the sugar lobby wins friends and targets its enemies. And this is pretty similar to the situation that we've all seen with Coca-Cola, how they have co-opted the loyalty of scientists to undermine this message that sugar is not really that bad for you. So, as I say, over the years, it became obvious that I was putting a target on the back of the program, and eventually in December of 2016, the ABC sacked us all, everybody on the team, from the executive producers all the way down to the program managers. It was just not feasible for them to have us there anymore. They really wanted to shift away from investigative science work, and they wanted to do the sort of fun, wow type of science where the presenters weren't really investigating the science issues. So that's kind of where they ended up. And, people ask me, if you had your time again, would you change your mind and not do these programs? And I actually do oscillate every now and then. I just think, wouldn't it be great? I could be a highly paid TV presenter. Instead, I lost my job and now I'm, working as a freelancer. But I think sufficiently enough time has passed now that I'm okay about this, and I wear it as a badge of honour. I think I did my job as a journalist. I asked the questions without fear or favour, so I don't have regrets about the programs I did. So I'm going to leave it there. Thank you for listening. If you want to hear more about or read more about my story, I published Statine Wars, Have We Been Misled by the Evidence, in the BJSM last year. So thank you for your time. I'll just say those programs that were banned, actually, they're still on the internet. So, if you've got spidery senses and you want to Google it, you could probably access them.
You have a question back here?
Well, not so much a question as totally supportive of what you've done. As many in the audience know, I wrote a book a couple of years ago called Breakfast is a Dangerous Meal. And I was astonished at how effectively the opposition to that could go. So, for example, Good Housekeeping magazine in England was going to write an article about this. And they pulled it at the end because the British Diabetic Association had persuaded them that I was unsound. And what I hadn't realised at that point is how much industrial money the British Diabetic Association receives.
Yep.
The Spectator magazine ran an article from a dietitian. She's absolutely out of her depth. She hadn't a clue what she's talking about. Clearly, she had worked in the past for the breakfast cereal companies. So I think your work is wonderful.
Thank you.
And anyone who doubts, anyone who might think that you're paranoid, well, you might be, but in that case, I am as well.
Thank you. You're absolutely right. Like these advocacy groups and so-called public authorities, that's a lot of the work that I've been investigating since I left the ABC. Much like the British Dietetics Association, the Dietitians Association of Australia and the Diabetes Australia accept money from pharmaceutical industries and the food industry. And we've been calling them out for that because they have not only been responsible for setting out the Australian dietary guidelines, they're also managing to kind of infiltrate the medical programs that doctors use, the medical handouts that doctors give to patients. So when you read close enough to this information, you see the sanitarium actually produced these pamphlets that doctors are giving out to patients. And Sanitarium is largely a breakfast cereal company where they, and this is advice to people with type 2 diabetes who can't control their blood sugar levels. And yet the advice that they're getting is to eat starchy foods, which turn into glucose. It is completely insane, but it's happening. Yeah.
I'm interested in this gag order. What did it look like, and how can they do that? I find that very disturbing.
Yeah. So I was pretty green at the time. I came from a science background, and I didn't really know what the consequences were or what it meant. I didn't sign anything, but receiving emails like that, where they said it would be a breach, they would consider this a breach in my employment conditions, I took it seriously. I mean, they were serious. I don't know, in retrospect, that if I had disobeyed them, I wasn't allowed to tweet, I wasn't allowed to talk to a journalist, I wasn't allowed to go to medical conferences, I wasn't allowed to write opinion pieces, so they were really stifling all of the work that I had been doing in this area. So it wasn't an official gag order.
So it wasn't from a lawyer, you didn't get a letter from a lawyer?
No. So that was from a head of factual. So he had spoken to director of television. So he's 2IC, seems important. And I would constantly get verbal communication on the phone saying, you cannot speak to this journalist, you cannot put your side of the story, the ABC will handle this. So their strategy is, for most crises, their strategy is just put your head down and don't give it oxygen and it'll go away. I do a bit of PR and crisis management for a health clinic in Melbourne, and I tell them the complete opposite now. Just because of my experience, I think that people are going to write terrible things about you, and if you have an opportunity to say something, then even if it's 1 or 2 lines in an article or 10 seconds on a TV interview, that's better than nothing at all, because then it's completely out of balance if you stay quiet. And I also think maybe staying quiet has this sort of air of, have they got something to hide? Even if you don't have anything to hide, which I didn't, are they trying to hide from something? So yeah, I would err on the side of always defending yourself in these situations. And they were very aware of not putting things in writing, so it's pretty astounding that I have evidence of silence from emails or leaked documents from the industry. You very rarely get your hands on the smoking gun. So it's been quite shocking over the years to see that these things actually named me as a person for active defence. Yeah.
I was very interested in the many different strategies you have to try to get data. You talked about going through different EU governments. You talked about court cases in Canada, your own experiences in Australia. I'm wondering, also with some of your disclosures, they seem like they were accident on the part of people who have no interest in making their data transparent. So I'm wondering if you think there's a particular forum or you're seeing more success by going through certain geographies or agencies, or if you're just doing a scatter shot and hoping that somehow you get better access to this clinical data.
We're trying to do a systematic review. So this is really we thought originally it was just going to be the European Medicines Agency, and it turned out that they only had the trial data for statin combined with something else. And we just wanted to analyse statin drugs on their own. And it was just a sort of pure discovery that we realised that each of the EU countries has their own drug regulators. So we ended up having to send out 32 or 33 letters of requests to all these different agencies. And I think over time, I mean, we're still in the early stages of investigating this, and drug regulators don't really like answering our requests. So we've probably got about half so far. The one thing we have realised is that this is not a process that's doctor friendly. So if you want to look at data that supports the marketing and licensing of one of the 7 statins, it's almost impossible to get a hold of. So this is what we're trying to do. We're trying to make this process easier so that it's kind of like a platform technique. So if somebody wants to do this with another drug class, they know exactly what to do. They know exactly what decentralized marketing processes are, or centralized marketing processes, and who holds the data. So yeah, and we felt that going to the drug regulator would be a kind of way of dealing with this issue that CTT holds the data away from independent researchers. Yeah. But it's a very long process, and it will take years for researchers to analyse those clinical study reports. So we also need funding. So if there's anyone that wants to fund our research, we welcome it.
Oh, good. All right, thank you very much.
Thank you.